Chapter 19. Steve tells his story. October 5th, 1966 to May 4th, 1967. During the 1966 and 1967 Supreme Court hearing, Steve Truscott told his story in court for the first time. For the hearing, he had been transferred briefly from Collins Bay Penitentiary in Kingston to Ottawa. Unprepared and shy, Steve faltered on the stand. He was always a quiet person and his voice was weak. Several times, judges had to tell him to speak up. The intimidating setting at the Supreme Court did not help. Besides his weak voice, Steve had one other problem: his memory. It was now almost 7 years from the original events. Steve had sat through 2 weeks of conflicting testimony in his original trial. Also, he had virtually no preparation for the hearing. Unlike his one-time buddy Butch George, he had no cheat sheet or prepared statement. He had no opportunity to review his original statement, nor to review the transcripts from the original trial. In his testimony at the Supreme Court, Steve said he remembered giving Lynn a ride to the highway the night she died. But he did not remember seeing Richard Galati or many others that evening. He remembered seeing the 1959 Chev. He remembered seeing Gord Logan and Dougie Oates, but he couldn't remember their testimony at his trial. In 1965, Steve had applied for parole. Now, even that came back to bite him. In the application, Steve had written, "Please grant me one chance to make a success of my life and prove that one dreadful mistake." To the prosecutor, this could mean only one thing: Steve was admitting his guilt. But Steve was only trying to provide the parole board with what they wanted to hear. Prison wisdom said parole was unlikely without admission of guilt. But to Steve, the dreadful mistake was the jury's verdict. The court heard from experts who stated that the time of death could have been as late as midnight on June 9th. The penis lesions were due to a skin condition Truscott suffered from for years, that the body was likely moved after death and placed in the woods. The defense trotted out experts to say the time of death could not be set from stomach contents. The Crown trotted out experts to say it could. This was not unlike the original trial. One expert for the Crown was missing. Dr. Peniston, the pathologist who did the autopsy, did not testify. Steve's defense team did not know it, but in the year before the hearing, Dr. Peniston had changed his ideas on the time of death. He had concluded that Lynn Harper likely died after 8 p.m., maybe as late as midnight. This meant that Steve Truscott could not be the killer. But the Supreme Court hearing would never hear Dr. Peniston say that. Steve's appearance before the Supreme Court backfired. In their final judgment, the court said that part of his testimony simply cannot be believed. The court denied his appeal by an 8-1 decision. Truscott was crushed. His last hope had disappeared. One small glimmer of hope did emerge from the Supreme Court. Unlike trials, the Supreme Court requires a panel of judges to review the legal process involved. The Supreme Court was a panel of 8 judges, headed by the Honorable Robert Teixeira, Chief Justice of Canada. Justice Emmett Hall wrote a dissenting opinion. He did not agree with the others. Justice Hall incidentally became known in Canada as one of the authors of our healthcare system. The trial was not conducted according to law, Justice Hall wrote. There were grave errors in the trial. Nothing that transpired on the hearing in this court or any evidence tendered before this court can be used to give validity to what was an invalid trial. His judgment had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. He simply said the trial was not fair and was not conducted according to law. The only remedy for a bad trial is a new trial, he wrote. But Justice Hall was only one of 8 Supreme Court judges on the case. His opinion was a legal footnote. In such cases, the majority rules. Steve had run out of options. He was 21 years old and faced life in prison. Chapter 20. An Almost Normal Life. October 21st, 1969 to March 29th, 2000. In 1963, 5 days before his 18th birthday, Stephen had been transferred from the relaxed atmosphere of the Ontario Training School to hard time, Collins Bay Penitentiary in Kingston, Ontario. He'd been given a suit 3 sizes too big and a small bit of freedom that he cherished. He made the trip from Guelph to Kingston without handcuffs. It was a stark contrast to the shackles and chains he had endured 3 years earlier. It was from Kingston that he made the trip to Ottawa for a Supreme Court hearing. After the court decision was announced, Steve swallowed his bitter disappointment and got on with his life, as much as one can under maximum security. He made friends, played baseball, third base, learned to be a millwright, became a broadcaster on the prison radio station. In 1967, he was transferred to the nearby farm annex in Kingston. They gave him considerably more freedom along with the physical challenge of farm work. Since his days on the Lawson farm, he considered himself a country boy. After 10 years in reform school and penitentiary, he had an unblemished record. He had earned the trust of the guards and prison staff. Life went on. His parents, stressed by 10 years of legal battles, divorced. In 1969, Steve was granted parole. He moved in with parole officer Mark Steinberg near Kingston. While there, Isabella Bourdet introduced him to a girl in Guelph who had taken a strong interest in the case and had campaigned for his freedom. Her name was Marlene. Eventually, they would marry. But parole comes with strings attached. The terms of his parole require him to live under assumed or fake name. Only a few of his closest friends knew his real identity. He couldn't leave the country, he couldn't move without permission, and he always carried the reputation of being a convicted killer. In 1971, working with journalist Bill Trent, Steve published his story up to his parole in 1969 in the book, The Stephen Truscott Story. In 1974, after 5 years on parole, Steve had some parole conditions lifted. He no longer had to report regularly to his parole officer. But the conviction and the injustice it symbolized still rankled. He and Marlene began raising a family. Leslie was born in 1971, Ryan 2 years later, and Devin in 1979. Raising children with a deep, dark family secret had its challenges. How much do you tell the children, and when? Their daughter, Leslie, was in high school when she found out. Unknown to her parents, Leslie was at the school library one day when she discovered a 1979 book, Who Killed Lynn Harper?, a reissue of the Stephen Truscott story. Leslie flipped through the pages and was surprised to find Truscott family photos in the book. She found many of her aunts and uncles. 2 years later, when her mother had decided that it was time she learned the truth, Leslie looked at the pile of books on the coffee table and said, "Mom, I know." Another time, when she was in grade 11, Leslie's class was studying law. One of the topics was the Truscott case. The teacher impressed on the class the unfairness he felt had been imposed on the process. After class, Leslie approached her teacher. She said she hoped the class would not discuss the Truscott case again. She said she made her uncomfortable. Her teacher said the case made him uncomfortable as well, knowing that an innocent boy could spend 10 years in jail. Leslie said she had an additional reason. Steve Truscott was her father. The stunned teacher got to meet Steve Truscott the next day. Once the children had grown, the need to shelter them lessened. Instead, for both Steve and Marlene, something else grew: the need to clear the Truscott name. Finally, in the 1990s, a number of forces converged. A radio reporter whom Marlene had met years before, when the Bill Trent book was released, now worked for the CBC. She had kept in contact with her. One day, the reporter asked if Steve would be interested in doing a national TV show on his case. By then, a new organization had begun to make a name for itself in Canadian news, the Association in the Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. Under the direction of lawyer James Lockyer, had started to get results in Canadian courts. Using legal procedures supported by up-to-date science, including DNA evidence, convictions were being overturned. Guy Paul Moran, David Milgaard, Donald Marshall Jr., Clayton Johnson, and in the U.S., Hurricane Carter. Miscarriages of justice, it seemed, were not that rare. DNA evidence had cleared Morin. If that science had existed in 1959, there would have been no conviction. Could that same science now free Stephen? Could exposure in the media help push for his injustice to be righted? Maybe. Steve was reluctant. He knew what it was like to get his hopes up and have them dashed. Marlene had been his main supporter. Now Lockyer joined the argument. This would be, he told Steve, the last chance to clear his name. Finally, after talking with their children, Steve and Marlene agreed. Let's do it. With AIDWYC in the Fifth Estate, a CBC public affairs program known for thorough research, Steve signed an agreement that any result of the investigation would be public information. If DNA confirmed his conviction, the public would be told. If new evidence did the same, the public would know. Steve said he had nothing to hide, nothing to lose, and his name and his freedom to gain. On March 29, 2000, CBC's The Fifth Estate broadcast a documentary that refueled the debate about his innocence.